Hey, this is Mike Younger, and you're listening to The Northern Report.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, friends. Welcome to The Northern Report. I'm your host, Sean Burns, and I'm coming right at you from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. We're right into the swing of things here in Season 2 of the podcast, and I'm happy to welcome Nashville-based, Nova Scotian-born songwriter Mike Younger to the show today. Take a moment here to thank the folks who took the time to come down to the Royal George Hotel, the legendary Royal George Hotel, this past Sunday. Catch us there on a Country Sunday. 3 sets, a grueling, punishing 3-setter. But what a great place to sing and play country music. Great crowd on Country Sunday at the Royal George. Hope to be back there soon. As I mentioned last week, the cat was out of the bag. It's still out of the bag. We're going to be on stage for the grand reopening inside the Times Changed High and Lonesome Club on Friday, October 22nd. Sean Burns and Lost Country, proud to be up there for 2 sets. Showtime starting at 8:30, doors at 7:30, and there's some advanced tickets available on Eventbrite. If for some reason you can't track them down there, get a hold of me and we'll sort you out. Get them while you can, folks. Should prove to be a good night down there at the old Times Changed High and Lonesome Club. Not much else to report here. I'm heading back home to Southern Ontario for Thanksgiving weekend. Going to take off on Sunday for a handful of days and come right back and get right back into the swing of things. Not going to bend your ear any more than that. Let's move on to the show. Proud to welcome Mike Younger to the Northern Report. Born in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Mike Younger left home at the age of 17 and cut his teeth as a fledgling street performer in Toronto and Vancouver. At the age of 20, he headed to New York City to seek out the 60s folk renaissance remnants. But it was while performing live on WWOZ in New Orleans that this renegade troubadour and poet of roots music caught his first break when a music publisher heard him on the broadcast. Soon after, Mike traveled to Nashville to record demos, and his recordings reached the ear of Rodney Crowell. When Mike signed his first record deal, Crowell stepped in as producer, and together they turned out Somethin In The Air in 1999. In 2001, Jim Dickinson started producing Mike's second album, which never saw the light of day. The original Memphis sessions featured legends Levon Helm, Spooner Oldham, David Hood, Jim Dickinson on piano, and his son Luther Dickinson on electric guitar. Tapes from that session fell into legal limbo and were lost for almost 2 decades. Now recovered, the recordings were completed, and Mike finally released Burning the Big Top Down on August 27th of this year. Rodney Crowell has said of Mike Younger, "No shit poetic realism with a tendency to museum qualities." No Depression has noted his songs of social conscience suggest Woody Guthrie, John Mellencamp, and Steve Earle. And easy yet effective turns of phrases a la Chris Christopherson proclaimed the LA Times. Now, folks, I'm a longtime fan of Mike Younger's, having come to his music via a close friend's copy of an early solo cassette recording called 20th Century Blues. The impact and influence that collection of songs had on me at the point in my life when I first heard it cannot be overstated. Mike is an artist that I have respected for some years now, and it was a treat to speak with him about his new album and his interesting life in music. We caught up on the phone just before the record came out at the end of August. And friends, I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Mike Younger.
I've been wanting to come up there and play for so long. I feel like, now is really a time for me to circle back and make contact with them and get all of my material together with them and hopefully be able to come up to Canada and work more often. That's really my goal, is to be closer to my folks and be able to stay working,
So when did you leave Halifax? How old were you when you split?
I was fresh out of high school. I was still 17. And at that time, of course, I was at the age that me and my folks didn't see eye to eye. And I needed to be calling the shots for myself. So the only way to do that was for me to go out on my own. And, it was a bunch of years of hitchhiking in Canada and playing in Vancouver and Toronto on street corners and learning my chops. And when I started being able to get into clubs, going and checking out the blues jams and jumping in when I felt comfortable, and open mics and all that stuff. That was my first, from 17 till 20, right out of high school. That was my experience. Most of it was in Vancouver, some in Toronto. And then when I was 20, I was like, I felt like, being a street musician I wanted to really, by that time I was aware of the Greenwich Village folk scene of the 1960s, right? Because I was totally, totally fascinated by Mr. Dylan and the entire Greenwich Village folk music renaissance of the 1960s, late 50s and 1960s. And, being a naive or idealistic kid, I was hoping and wishing that was still there, that I could find it, that I could find people that would play, roots music, and that I could fall into some sort of a scene. And I eventually did, later on in New York, but that wasn't my first chapter. My first chapter was the hard landing and orientation.
So when you were 17, were you already pretty handy on the guitar and as a performer? Had you had much experience when you were a teenager playing music live?
Well, I started writing tunes when I was 14 or 15 in there,
Yeah.
And learning Simon and Garfunkel tunes and Beatles tunes and CCR and stuff like that. But most of my experience, up to 17 was, this is not a good example to be setting for, baby. It's not a good example to be setting for the youngsters, but I was cutting a lot of classes. I had discovered I could go down to the city library and play on the steps, from 11 in the morning until the business day was done, and all the business people downtown would eat there at lunchtime, and there was several waves of traffic that came through. And it was, 10-minute walk from my high school. So if I didn't feel like going to physics class, I just went down to the library and opened my guitar case and started playing. And by 2 or 3 o'clock, I had significant money for, 15, 16-year-old kid. And, it was through that lens that I saw I could do this anywhere. I could travel the world this way. Mm-hmm. And by the time I graduated high school, I was keen on doing just that,
And you're playing folk tunes and Bob Dylan songs, you writing your own tunes as well?
I was playing everything from the Rolling Stones to the Grateful Dead, and gradually became aware of John Prine and Woody Guthrie and stuff, because I was reading about and all the blues guys. I was into Led Zeppelin too. I played some of their tunes. Obviously I was with an acoustic guitar, so I was limited as far as the riffing, but I sang and accompanied myself on the guitar. And, when I dug into Led Zeppelin's roots, I discovered Sonny Boy Williamson, and it just led to this, an education that was the first chapter to becoming aware of the fact that this music, all is derivative. This rock and roll thing is derivative of these Southern traditions of country and rhythm and blues and bluegrass and blues music and soul music and gospel music. And, but kicking around Canada for a few years there and learning how to make it, how to play John Denver songs and Don McLean and Bob Dylan and all of the tunes, some Rolling Stones, some Pink Floyd, the tunes that a street musician can, make a little go. I had a pretty hefty set of cover material like that, and it was mostly modern. But, like I said, when I was 20, I left Canada to head into the U.S. And my first chapter there was New York, which was, in search of the Greenwich Village folk scene. And I I really ended up sort of getting swallowed up by street life and living in abandoned buildings. And my hard landing / orientation in New York was a whole thing unto itself that led me, you know, and at the same time, simultaneously, my musical consciousness is expanding, and I'm becoming aware of more and more of this music. And it's starting to really dawn on me that the wellspring for this music was in the South, you know, in the southern states. This is where blues and country and bluegrass sort of mixed and melded and created new and unique genres. So I felt drawn towards that, and after a winter freezing my hide in New York, I headed out for New Orleans, and that's where, you know, like the secondary part of my education on music really began. Which, you know, I mean, as a musician down there, you're just like you're sort of marinating in a stew of country and Cajun and blues and bluegrass and rhythm and blues and soul and gospel and all these forms. And, you know, I spent a bunch of years down there soaking as much of that stuff up as I could stylistically.
Listening to your music, like, I always got the sense, you know, industry is so quick to want to slap a label on you as an artist, whether you're, you know, Americana or singer-songwriter or whatever. But for me, like, your stuff is just like a great amalgamation of American music. Like, you can hear that you've familiarized yourself with all of that stuff and that it's influenced you, and you're in these big cities like in New York and New Orleans especially, like so it's obviously really impacted the way that you're performing and writing songs, I suppose.
I mean, you know, when you start writing songs, you're a blank slate. You know, when you're a kid, you haven't experienced life yet. Nobody's kicked you in the balls and left you on the side of the road. You know what I mean? Metaphorically speaking, you know,
yeah.
I mean, maybe some 14-year-old kids have had a harder ride than I had, but I didn't start really experiencing, you know, hard times until I was out on my own like that at 17, and it, you know, the way I've always coped with that in my life, difficult, challenging problems in life, has always been sort of by digesting it through songwriting, you know, trying to find my way through just unpacking the experience in terms of poetry and trying to collect my thoughts and feelings about something. That's always, you know, I was in a dangerous environment from when I was young on my own, on the streets and stuff like that. And my mantra was like, stay close to the music, always. You know, I got sidetracked, the wrong crowd here and, you know, a bad scene there and all these things, but I always it always resonated with me deep inside me to stay close to the music. And, you know, that kept me out of a lot of trouble that other people that I knew ended up getting into, you know.
Yeah, so were you doing the same kind of thing when you ended up landing in Vancouver, like street performing, or were you playing in clubs at that point yet?
Well, that was my first stop. Like going back to your when did you leave question. At 17, I split right after high school and I hitchhiked. I didn't know where I was going. My family and I were not getting along. They wanted to tell me how I needed to you know, I was just at that age that they were struggling with letting go of control, and I was struggling to gain control of my life. And I just wanted out as far away from that as I could. And I didn't really take their feelings much into consideration in hindsight. I wish I could have been a better, you know, son or whatever. But I split and went as far as away from there as I could, and that was Vancouver. I hitchhiked all the way. I didn't know if I was going to stop in Montreal or Toronto, but when I was coming through those cities, I was so overwhelmed. I was so overwhelmed by the size and magnitude and that, not knowing anybody or whatever, that I was just out of sheer terror of a 17-year-old green kid, you know, I was fresh out of the nest, a fledgling, you know, out there in the world. I just kept going. I was like, man, I don't know what will happen to me if I stop here in Toronto, but end up in the shelter with all the old men and all that stuff. So I just kept moving until there was no more, until I ran out of road, and that was Vancouver, you know. And when I got there, first I was still 17, so I was playing in the streets, and some punk rock kids that I knew on the strip sort of looked out for me. And when I got myself into some trouble because I was on my own, I was easy prey for, you know, the kind of predators that that look for young kids on the street and stuff like that. I was lucky enough to have this peer group of, pretty, rough little punk rock kids, little brothers and sisters, the purple hair and the spikes on their leathers and all that shit. And I ended up living in a house with them for a long time, and so I honed my sort of Oliver Twist experience and got really good at going down to Granville Street and Granville Island and making my contribution to the rent, and took it seriously like a job. And it was towards the very end of my time in Vancouver, which would have been like right before I was like up to 19 or so, which would have been 91 or so. I was still underage, I was not 18, 19, but I was old enough. I looked old enough that I was able to get into some of these blues jams and open mics at the bars and stuff like that. So I was starting to get into that circle as I was approaching like the 20th year. Then I started to really, really want to go to New York and find this folk scene. So I left Vancouver and moved back to Toronto and was there for about 6 to 8 months before I left Canada. And I was playing clubs there by then too.
In Toronto?
Yeah.
Playing solo, or did you have a band?
No, I was still doing the solo thing, but let me think. That neighborhood, Kensington Market, is where I lived when I went back to Toronto, and very similar to New York culturally, like Jamaican shop next to a Chinese vegetable market, next to a Greek falafel place. Very multicultural and ethnic, and it sort of. I love it. Looking back, it's a time that holds a lot of fond memories for me. I had good friends there and have maintained ties with some of them, but it really prepared me for what I was about to experience in New York. It was like a microcosm of the multicultural melting pot that I was about to plunge into.
I've always wanted to ask you about 20th century blues and when you did that and how that all came about. Were you in Toronto at that point, or when did you do that?
No, but I recorded that whole thing on. You used to be able to get really good cassette players with a microphone or a recording microphone, ambient microphone built into the boombox. I don't think they make them like that anymore. It's the radios and stuff that I've seen over the years on construction sites and stuff like that. They include that equipment less and less for some reason. I guess maybe because there's so many other ways to record. But I just set up a cassette deck in my kitchen and tried to control external sounds and experimented with playing close to the microphone versus further away from the microphone and all these things until I, arrived. That was my sound production back then. Pretty rudimentary, but that was New Orleans. That was that whole batch of tunes was songs that I was writing and recording down there. And New Orleans is such a fascinating musical culture, but I always struggled with the fact that the singer-songwriter and original material was not really the focal point of New Orleans musical culture. New Orleans' musical culture is based on tradition and standards, and so from a songwriting standpoint, I was frustrated, but at the same time, I was inadvertently soaking up all of this musical tradition. So in hindsight, it was very valuable to me, the experience. But there was very little outlet for those original songs. So I was recording them to cassette, and then I would be playing. I'd mix them into my set when I was playing up on the boardwalk for tourists. And I would, it gave me something to sell. I would sell those cassettes for $5, $6, $7 or whatever, and it would totally supplement my income. It contributed to what I went home with, because tourists who usually drop you $1 or $2, they'll drop you $1 or $2 or whatever. But if they're buying a record, it's a lot more. You get a lot more mileage out of it. And then, like you, unexpectedly, some people really were drawn to that music, and it became meaningful to them. And 20 years later, they still have it. Like you, I was just blown away that you had it already. I mean, it converted to digital files and stuff. That's so. I mean, it's so cool.
It's cool. It's funny. So I was sort of, when I first heard it, I was sort of like fresh off of my, Bob Dylan fascination with the early era Dylan. And I was really blown away that, with the whole thing, and so I got it from a friend of mine named Ralph McDonald. He's originally from near Port Hawkesbury, and he'd been in Toronto since the early 80s, and he got the cassette from a waiter who also had a secondhand store somewhere on Queen Street East, and I think the club was maybe the Q Club that the guy was working at. So he gave him the cassette, and Ralph digitized it and sent it to some of his pals that would appreciate it, and he and I were on a tour in the Maritimes 10 years ago, and just listen to it like every day and try to surmise like, who's this Mike Younger guy? And then Ralph was like, well, he's doing a farewell to Nova Scotia. He's got to be from out here somewhere. And it was like, you were just this like phantom. We didn't know fucking clue who you were. So I sort of always wanted to ask you about it. And you're like, obviously had a lot of hours as a solo performer at that point, because you're an accomplished guitar player, not just like the folk singer playing the chords under the story. It's like it's quite a performance. So to think that you just had in your kitchen in New Orleans and then it ended up in this bookstore in Toronto is kind of cool.
I mean, I never would have imagined that it would be as far reaching.
Yeah.
It's as the older I get, I mean, as a musician, I'm sure you know that you can relate to. We all have ambition and dreams about our music making an impact and reaching a wide audience and having success. So our acknowledgement or something like that. Some musicians, allow that to occupy more of their bandwidth than others. But we all start out with ambitions and dreams, and over the course of a lifetime, take some hits on that stuff, and you have to lower your expectations or manage your expectations and of what you're going to get out of it and all these things. And it's been, as I get older, it's been really quite amazing and gratifying and meaningful to me that some of this music that I've put out over the years has reached, it actually did have a wide listenership in forms and ways that I didn't expect, like this that we're talking about.
Yeah.
20th Century Blues.
Do you ever revisit that material in a live show if you're playing solo? I haven't in a really long time, but since you've shared those files with me, I opened up a couple of them, and I haven't really been able to dive into it because I've got so much administrative management type of stuff that I'm dealing with around the release of this new record, that I've been just full bore on that stuff. But as soon as I can get on the other side of the radio promotion campaign and the publicity campaign and the touring, the booking and touring equation is sort of moving along at a good clip, I plan to open that stuff up and see if maybe there's something there that can be on a future record, Like, those are songs that I wrote and recorded and was done with long before I ever had a publishing deal or anything like that. So you really have the only record of it. So now I'm going to open them up and see what's there. And if there's some great, if there's some material that I can dust off and rearrange, it very well may end up on some of those tunes very well may end up on a future project. And you did re-record a couple of them on the record you did with Rodney Crowell, right?
Well, that gives you an indication of the time frame. So I made that record with Rodney. I made that record with Rodney in 2000, and I left New Orleans in 96. I went back to New York. So it would have, I had been playing. That cassette would have been probably recorded right around 95, 96 in there. And then I hung on to those songs long enough to get into a publishing deal in 99. Because Somethin In The Air was the song that really kind of sealed the deal for me to get into a publishing deal. and then made that record with Rodney a year later.
So you got the publishing deal before you connected with Rodney. How did all that happen that you ended up in Nashville?
Well, it was really kind of a fairy tale thing, you know. I mean, I had married a singer down in New Orleans. She was just an amazing blues singer, and it didn't work out between us, unfortunately. She's passed away as well. Her street handle was Ragtime Annie, but her name was Lisa Driscoll, my first wife. And she and I were falling out by this time, and it was kind of a rough and unpleasant parting of ways, in which I found myself on the streets again. And I was trying to figure out my next moves there in New Orleans and crashing on sofas. I had some brothers helping me out, you know, helping me through that moment. And John Sinclair, a radio disc jockey on WWOZ, which broadcast out of Louis Armstrong Park, which is right there next to the French Quarter. He had a radio show, and he was starting to feature more and more local people, right, on his radio show. And he invited me. I had participated in some fundraisers for some legal stuff that you know, all these tourists move to New Orleans and then they start complaining about the music, you know, it's too loud, the trumpets are too loud. And so there was this ongoing legal battle for the street musicians. I participated in that and performed in fundraisers and stuff, and got a little, you know, expanded my network of people. And John Sinclair was one of them, and he invited me to play on WWOZ. I was, you know, I was one step up from homeless. So I was like living on, you know, friends' sofas and stuff like that. But I went over and played on his show instead of doing my regular shift down at the river on the boardwalk. And he played a couple tunes, and it was this strange aligning of the stars for me. There happened to be a Nashville publisher in a vehicle driving in New Orleans. I think he was on his way to the airport or on his way. He wasn't able to come to the station right away, but before I left the station, he called WWOZ studio. He said, tell me some information about this person that's just played a couple of tunes on the air. You know, I want to know about him. Is he there still? And we made contact, and he came down to see me and hear some more tunes a couple weeks later. And then he asked me about my level of interest in getting into a publishing agreement where I would be, you know, on a stipend, on a monthly salary to write songs, to deliver, you know, X number of songs per year. And I mean, for a street musician who had just been kicked around a little bit like I had been, it was like my ship came in, you know. I was like, hallelujah. And I jumped in with those guys and started coming up to Nashville to cut demos on those songs with studio musicians and stuff that they set me up with. And ironically enough, the material that publisher pitched to Rodney Crowell was all self-produced stuff, with me playing all the instruments, the bass and the drums and the guitar and the piano. Again, very rudimentary stuff, but, you know, it had enough vibe, and it was different from all the other stuff that Rodney had on his listening list, that it struck a chord with him. And he got back to the publisher and said, who is this artist? I want to meet him, and all that stuff. And we had coffee a couple times, and then broke out the guitars, and he was like, let's make a record. And that was my first foray into being a recording artist. It all happened quite quickly. My transition from being a street musician to a recording artist was very, you know, I wouldn't say overnight, but once it happened, it happened pretty quick. And I was not very business savvy. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I don't regret any of the decisions that I made at that time. You know, I did what came instinctual to me. I did the best that I could. And those folks were all awesome people. It's just, we ran into other obstacles later on the second record, which, you know, is the second record we were making for that label, the one after Rodney's. You know, Rodney's, the record he produced, Somethin In The Air, got some traction. It got me a visibility and across the country in AAA radio, and I toured some. And I got to open for Nancy Griffith on, you know, maybe two weeks of shows, or maybe 3, back right around 9/11. And there was a bunch of cool stuff that happened for me back then. But, you know, when it came time to make the second record, and I went to Memphis, and then you know, some of the resulting story, you know, I really like hit a wall there when I lost that record, and the record deal collapsed, and I was just sort of left hanging to pick up the pieces. And over the years, I put a bunch of work, but, you know, I mean, this record that I'm just putting out this week, or release date is day after tomorrow. It's occupied so much space in my head over the last 20 years, because it's always, you know, you go forward wondering what if, wondering all the things that could have transpired had that record not been lost.
Because you put out a few records in between, right? Like there's a 3 that I've been able to track down, 2005, 2010, 2017 releases, and then your new one, Burning the Big Top Down. If you want to dig into it a little bit more, just to kind of paint the picture of what happened, because you made this record 20 years ago and it's coming out in 2 days.
Yeah. So, you know, on the second record for this record label, Jim Dickinson expressed the interest. I had moved by then. I was up in New York, back in New York City, and sort of floating. I had broken up with my girlfriend. I was sort of drifting and living in my car and stuff. And Jim expressed interest in producing the second record. And I had a little downtime. I had finished working Somethin In The Air pretty much. It had waned. I worked it for a couple of years. This would have been 99. Wait, 2000 was when the late 99 is when Somethin In The Air came out, and I worked that all year. And then we were getting ready to make that second record in the spring of in the new year of 2001. And Jim had me down, and I played a couple of tunes for him, and he had just finished, I think, I'm trying to remember the name of the Bob Dylan record he had just produced. He had just produced one. You'll have to do that. It's not coming to me right off the top of my head, but he had produced Dylan's record, I think in 99 or 2000, right in there somewhere. And you know, and he started dropping names of the band that he wanted to put together around me, and I was just like a little bit stunned in disbelief, because I mean, here I'm living out of a knapsack and a pickup truck with a topper on it, you know, trying to have a life in between records. I was all in, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
I didn't have a lot to come home to at the end of the tour. So I was really in limbo and happy to get back into it with Jim, and went down there in January of 2001. And, you know, here comes Levon Helm, here comes Spooner Oldham, here comes David Hood, and Luther Dickinson as well, Jim's son, you know, who plays with the North Mississippi All-Stars. And obviously there's Levon, who I've been watching in his, you know, in the clips of the band since I was 13, 14, and Spooner and David, you know, who I quickly became aware were like on those early recordings with Aretha Franklin and a whole, you know, a rap sheet of amazing artists as long as my arm.
Yeah.
Throughout the 60s and 70s. And David Hood even went back to, like, I mean, he played on Slim Harpo's tunes back in the late 50s. I mean, I felt like I was really amongst giants, you know, like rock and roll royalty. And it was terrifying and delightful, and in the end heartbreaking. But, you know, all of that is part of life, right? All those things. You can't have the roses without the thorns, kind of thing. It was a tremendous growing experience for me to work with those guys, because they took these raw tunes that I had and put it into a context, like, oh, this is that kind of New Orleans stroll tune. He was like, yeah, this is kind of like that Raining in My Heart tune that Slim Harpo cut in '58 or whatever. He's like, let's bring it up. Let's bring it up a couple beats per minute, and then, switch this seventh, into a minor or whatever. We messed around with some chords, and it was, to be in the creative process with these guys was like, it's difficult to describe, but I had definitely felt a feeling that I had accomplished something coming from where I came from, playing on the street corners,
For sure. I mean, did you ever, like when you're writing and performing these songs as a solo performer, like, did you ever envision what they'd sound like with a band, or were you just kind of trying to give them the best life you could as a solo act?
I think I always hear the material when I'm writing it and feeling it and putting it together. I'm always hearing band arrangements, but I'm starting to think more in terms of, the logistics of keeping a 4 or 5 person outfit afloat on the road.
Yeah.
The logistics and the finances of it are challenging. I've only been able to make the numbers work a few times. Most of the time if it's your crew, you take a loss. You're shouldering all of that expense and all of the travel and the lodging and all these things. So, I wanted a band. That was where I felt comfortable. I was hearing the music that way. I had ideas of what the piano should be doing there and what the lead guitar and the drums should be doing. But I also, when I was, even then, I was writing songs that, as I was writing them, I could envision them, if you will, fleshed out with a band, but I was always conscious of the fact that the reality of the fact that I was going to be most likely performing these tunes as a solo. So I had to develop arrangements for both. And in a way, it's been a really great catalyst for growth, because as much as I love to play with a band and take a band out on the road, which I love, there's nothing more that I love than that. I mean, my mother, my girlfriend,
yeah,
no, but there's very few things that I wanted more than to be able to float a band, and that's still the case today. But I have learned to see the advantage of being versatile as a musician and being able to hold down a show and deliver a compelling performance as a solo artist, because you're not impeded by other people's schedules and financial needs. And, there's just a lot more flexibility that comes with it.
Absolutely.
It's not appropriate for every room. Not every rock club wants a solo artist on their stage, but, I have learned to appreciate being flexible enough to do both, and the creative process unfolds now with a two-track idea. One is what it sounds like with the band, and the other is how it's going to sound when I play it solo.
Right, for sure.
My writing and performance has really developed around that dichotomy.
Yeah, putting them over solo and the freedom of playing solo. I can totally relate because I love playing with a band as well. But when you go and take them out on your own and you're on your own, there's something different about the relationship with the song. And I mean, so it sounds like you didn't have really any experience in a proper studio prior to making the record with Rodney Crowell. Is that right?
Well, I would say in the year before I actually went into the studio with Rodney Crowell, that publisher was bringing me up to Nashville.
Oh, right.
And taking me into studios and cutting publishing demos. But you're right in that there was never an official recording. I mean, there were publishing demo sessions are very different from a recording session. Yeah, I mean, it's not the same pressure and it's not the same goal. You're just trying to get a documentation of the song in a publishing demo. And that's what I was doing. I was just pretty much rolling it off the street and playing it the way I would play it on a street corner for passersby. And then gradually, through repetition of that experience of recording publishing demos, I was like, well, let me circle back and put a bass line on that, because I think it would sound a little cooler if there was something else just besides just the acoustic guitar driving. And then, little baby steps like that. And by the time I went into the studio with Rodney, I wouldn't say I was experienced, but I was no longer like a total newbie.
Right.
Experience.
But you find yourself with these giants like Jim Dickinson and Levon and Rodney Crowell. Like at that point in your life and your career, were you comfortable and confident to provide some input on the production and for the musicians as well, or were you just kind of soaking it all in and focused on your own performance?
I've always tried to retain some control of the production, and I had some ideas that were different from Rodney's on that first record, but I deferred to his experience. I certainly deferred to his experience on that. He gave some of those songs on that first record a treatment that were just outstanding, and I probably wouldn't have. I wouldn't have come to that myself. Every person's fingerprints are different, so obviously it would have been different had I been producing it. But I learned a tremendous amount in that process about how you get the basic tracks, live with a bass, drum, and guitar and keys, and then there's some fine tuning, come back over it and fix your vocals. I was still really into getting vocals off the floor, live vocals at that time. Nowadays, I'm a little bit more particular, and I want the best performance going out that can be going out. So I will repeat my vocals until I get it right, But at that time, I was shooting from the hip, and I was opinionated for sure. I had my own ideas about what my music should sound like, and there were places where my vision of the record and Rodney's diverged, and the other places where they converged. But I rolled with it because, from my point of view at that point, Rodney was something of a gatekeeper for me, and I did not want to get in his way and be my own worst enemy, So I let him really steer that creative process. And when I got around to making that second record with Jim Dickinson, I came into it with a notebook full of notes on those songs, on what I wanted here and what I wanted there. And, Jim humored me. He could empathize with my innocence and naivete. And he actually did empathize with my creative vision. There's no doubt. And applied his own skill set to see that vision to its manifestation. And we discussed at length during those sessions how the horns were going to go and how the background vocals were going to go, and that we were going to put some guitar work on there afterward. Like Luther was going to come back and do some overdubs and lead guitar and stuff. We never got to do that, obviously. I ended up having to take over that production when I retrieved the tapes in 2017, and really held as close as I could to the vision that Jim and I had discussed way back in 2001, with the exception of rewriting a couple of those songs, a couple of the tracks that we had recorded in 2001. The songs just weren't strong enough, although the band performance was sensational. So I took artistic license in 2017 and 18 and rewrote a couple of those tunes to provide my own social commentary on the things that I was seeing out in the world at that time.
And like, so just so the folks that tuned in are clear, it's like you tracked a lot of this record in Memphis in 2001, and then the studio closed, and then you couldn't track down the tapes, or what happened?
Yes, that part of the story is definitely very historically significant. Actually, there's Jack Holder is a rock guy going back to early 70s. Rock producer in Memphis, and he had this awesome little studio called Sounds Unreal, and he had a temperature controlled, humidity controlled vault in there for 2-inch tape, and there was some gold in there. I mean, there was like, I didn't go into the vaults because that's like a protected area, you know, there's a protocol, all these things, but there's Al Green tapes in there, there's Otis Redding tapes in there, there's all kinds of, you know, and it was just a little hole in the wall. You know, you're in kind of a rough neighborhood in Memphis, and you roll up and you're like, which place is it? And, you know, it was just a nondescript type of little house, but they had it laid out to, you know, where there was a console and a control room and a window and isolation booths that everybody could see each other and all these things. And, you know, when the session, we recorded for 3 days. I arrived there and everybody had already assembled, and they were getting acquainted and telling stories about their travels and adventures as young guys in the heyday of the band or in the Muscle Shoals sound, and they were talking about those Aretha Franklin sessions, and it was really, you know, I was in awe. And then we dove into the recording, and I was very uptight and self-conscious the whole time, I'm sure. And I told myself that I would keep to the straight and narrow and not indulge in any of my normal indulgences, but by 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. I had already passed on, like, you know, 3 big joints that went around the room. So I was like, well, you know, I'm gonna be outside the circle if I don't dive in here. So here I go. Yeah. But anyway, like we did the 3 days of recording, and it all was just a fabulous experience. And on the 4th day, I showed up at the studio, and it was like somebody had died, the vibe in there. And Jim took me aside and he said, your record label called this morning, and there's a problem. You need to call them and see if you can get it worked out. And in short order, you know, I was on the phone with my manager in Los Angeles, and they had hit a financial iceberg and were pulling the plug on a bunch of records they had going. And mine was one of those. And it was a disaster. I had to go back into the other room and tell everybody that we were going to get it worked out, but it was going to take some time, and I don't know how it's going to work out yet. And, you know, it was just like a most horrible moment. And Jim says, well, not to worry, we'll get it finished up. You and your manager sort it all out, and we'll resume. And the tape stayed in Memphis, and within 3 or 4 days, it became apparent that there was going to be no resolving of the situation from Los Angeles. And we were on our own to deal with the producer, who was not budging because his interests, you know, he was responsible for all those musicians getting paid. So, you know, I understood. I was unable to persuade him to allow me to have tracks to take to some other label to see if we could get the project bought out. So there the tapes stayed in their vault. And, you know, I have to be careful sometimes when I'm talking about this, because there's some parts of the story that are legally sort of perilous for me to discuss. I mean, the situation as it unfolded did not reveal qualities of of honor and character in some of the business people that I had jumped in with, and my trajectory as a musician suffered for that. And the record, I was in a 6-record deal, and they were not going to let me go. They wanted to recoup some of the money that they had invested in me, and so that there was an extraordinary cost to getting my release papers from a 6-record deal. I could not swing it, so we had to fight them, and I didn't get released from that record deal until fall of 2003, early 2004, something like that. Yeah, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't move forward as an artist. And all I wanted when I finally got my walking papers was to get the hell out of Tennessee, Nashville and Memphis. And so I went back up to New York then and restarted a band with some old friends of mine. And that was the band that recorded Every Stone You Throw, which came out 2004 or 2005, something like that.
But when you finally do retrieve the tapes from Memphis, like, is that just bittersweet?
Sorry. I only gave you part of the story. I left you hanging. So in 2017, I'm looking at my social media, and by 2017, I have already the news of Levon dying, and then Jim Dickinson a couple of years after him. My hopes really, I still had some flicker of hope that maybe one day I could get these tapes back, right? But when, Levon passed away, I knew he and I were never going to get to listen back together. And then Jim passed away, and I realized that, okay, the odds just got a lot slimmer that I'm going to be able to get this thing back. And then Jack Holder, the owner of the studio, that sounds unreal, his obituary came across my social media. And the lady that gave the eulogy, she was memorializing him at a public event that was being covered by the media in Memphis. That lady, Dawn Hopkins, is actually, she was at the sessions and took care of some of the administrative work for Jack Holder, and has gone on to become a fairly well-known producer out of Memphis. But she became like the living link to that thing for me, and I started tracking her down, and I eventually found her. And when I got her on the phone, I said, hello, you might not remember, but my name's Mike Younger. I recorded in Memphis by this time it's like 16 years after. It's like I recorded with Levon and Spooner and David Hood and Jim Dickinson. She's like, I remember that session. And she said, and I said, I'm really trying to find those tapes. Do you know where they might be? I saw that that Jack died and the studio is going to be closing. I was hoping to maybe make an interception somewhere and see what I can do about, settling up all of the business around that record and putting it out. And she said, I know exactly where those tapes are. And my suspicion was confirmed that she was going to be the one to transfer all the tapes that they had left in their vault, in their temperature-controlled and humidity-controlled vault. All that tape was going to have to be moved somewhere, right, when the studio closed down. And I just suspected that's probably going to be Dawn. And I was absolutely right. And she was in the process of getting all those tapes, if not had already moved all those tapes into a different vault. And she knew exactly where mine were. And, we discussed it a little further. We brought Luther, Jim's son, into the conversation. And I announced my intention to, get everything worked out. Make sure that, I was honor bound to do. Mm-hmm. And I felt that. This is my heroes, I was not going to handle them the way that label handled them. Once I got the tapes back and started digging into the creative process, I also started backtracking and making contact with the widows of Jim Dickinson and Levon Helm, and Spooner, Oldham, and David Hood are still alive. So I made contact with them through the Musicians Union, and we came to terms, and I was able to really clear up the karma, the business karma around that record. And during COVID, I was able to take care of all that. So it was really gratifying and meaningful to me that during a time such challenge for everybody, I was able to show up and, settle up.
Yeah.
And everybody, all the people that were involved, we have dozens of horror stories about getting ripped off in the music business. I mean, between David Hood and Spooner, Jim Dickinson and Levon Helm, there's a long history of crooked, shortchanged music business stories. And very rarely did people show up out of the woodwork 15, 20 years later after a recording project with a check in hand to make things right. And that's exactly what I did, because that was how it should have been handled in the very beginning. And I spent 20 years of my life, hurting about the fact that, this disaster had happened in my business life. And reclaiming the record also gave me an opportunity to settle all that up. And that's like the added perk of this record for me is I got to make good on all that stuff and get on an even keel with everybody that was involved.
Yeah. And you brought in a whole batch of new great musicians to track some more tracking on the record, and like you said, you do some rewriting.
There was some horns and singers and some electric guitars to be added, and like I said, there was a couple of songs there that I felt were not up to the level of the playing, and I felt I've waited 17 years to get this record back. It's going to take me several years to get it together to put it out. I'm going to take poetic license to make these two songs that I didn't feel too hot about. I'm going to take the artistic license to make them the best songs that I can make them within the chord structure of the tracks that exist. And they were rewritten with new melodies and lyrics, and really underwent this incredible transformation to lead to the song Layin' Low and Lord of the Fleas. Both of those songs came out of the darkest years of the Trump presidency. And I just felt who's to say, really, but I felt that I would have had Jim and Levon's blessing in that too. I felt that when I put pen to paper, I was like, but those guys didn't sign on to make any kind of statement like this. But I overcame that, because I think that Levon was a very warm, community-oriented person. He loved his community in Woodstock, and he was no stranger to the activism of the 1960s and being part of the civil rights, peripherally being part of the civil rights movement by their association with the Staples and a host of other singers. He was no stranger to the social activism of rock and roll in the 1960s, and I felt through that lens that I would have his blessing by utilizing the platform of this record to send out smoke signals, about, this crazy, regressive time, this regressive chapter in American history where we actually started moving backwards. Instead of moving the whole thing forward by inches, we actually moved backwards by several yards, over those past couple of years. So I felt it was important and incumbent on me as a songwriter to speak to that. And those two weak songs on the record gave me the opportunity to do it.
Well, it's true. It's a triumph. It's the quote that I pulled up here said it's been called a triumph 2 decades in the making. And like you said, just getting it out is like got to feel like a little bit of weight off your back, and to take that artistic license to write those new tunes. They really fit. Like it doesn't feel like there's this 20-year gap on the record. It really holds up together like a really nice album, man.
I have. It's important for me to say that in the post-digital transfer part, it's a long story. There's a lot of details. I'm sorry. I apologize for that. It's convoluted. It's hard to sum it up. But when I got those tapes back, and I came back from Memphis with 8 2-inch reels of tape with that record on it, I took them to Ray Kennedy, who's like really top shelf sound engineer, audio tech here in town. He's produced Lucinda Williams and Steve Earle, and he took the tapes through this process called baking, which removes any moisture that could potentially damage them when you put them on the machine. He took them through that baking process, and then he transferred those analog files into digital. And I went from there with that to my buddy Chad Brown, who is like an audio wizard and a brother in the trenches, and somebody who stepped up to help me take that unfinished record, put the treatment that Jim Dickinson and I had discussed way back, 17, 18 years before, with the background vocals, the horns, some lead guitar, and, Chad Brown is his name. He is credited as co-producer because Jim Dickinson produced the original sessions, but really the mountain of work that he and magic that he was able to see that record through to completion in this seamless way that people that are listening to it now are like, it doesn't sound like there was two different sessions happening, like everybody, there's a continuity and a seamlessness to it. That's all Chad Brown. And I think I probably haven't made enough noise about him yet, because I've been mostly focusing on answering the questions about me and my career and all these things. But this record, I really owe him a lot to have been able to get it this far, really.
Have you, how long did you maintain the publishing deal? Like, are you still writing songs in Nashville, like going into the office, writing tunes kind of thing, or?
No, my publishing deal ended in like 2003, 2004, something like that. The music business has been in contraction over the last 15 years or so. And, there's less and less of that type of business opportunity circulating for creatives. I mean, they exist, but going into an office to write from 9 to 5 is not really my vibe anyway.
I wouldn't think so. Yeah.
But I can, coming out of that whole experience, I really, really was impacted in the sense that I felt I could no longer allocate the responsibility on somebody else for me to get my business affairs together. I came out of that experience, and it's taken me many, many years to learn the music business inside out, all the aspects of it and all that stuff. It started with publishing. I started my own publishing company and started registering my songs under my own publishing company, where now I own 100% of them. I don't have to share that with another company. I mean, I would be happy to come up off of 50% of that if the company was going to be pitching the songs and getting them placed in film and TV and all these things. But if somebody's not going to be actively working it, it behooves the songwriter to hang on to that and not give it over so easily. And so, as the music business has contracted, my outlook and perspective on it also has changed in that, and my ability, my effort to get a grasp on the business side of it and really not depend on other people to do that for me has been this exponentially growing latent talent of mine. I was never good at business, and now I'm finally, I went through this crazy story, and now I just feel like I've got my hands on the wheel for the first time in a long time, and I live moment to moment worried that I'm certainly going to drop the ball and make mistakes and all these things. But so far so good. I feel like I've done a better job of pulling my business together this time around this record than I ever had before. That's like one of the positives out of the whole situation.
Man, congratulations on getting this record out. It's great, and I hope the show goes well, and I hope you get to do your dates up there in September too, man.
Thank you, Sean. Let me know. Send me a link when your piece comes out or when the podcast.
Well, friends, I hope that you've enjoyed my chat with Mike Younger. Got to thank Mike for taking the time to talk with me and for sharing his story with us on the podcast. I'm happy to report that Mike did get to do those dates in September, and I'm real happy to hear that they went well. Listen to Mike's albums wherever you're streaming music for a nominal monthly fee, or check him out at mikeyounger.com. Follow along with the Northern Report Spotify playlist to hear music from the folks that I've covered here on the podcast, as well as in the Honky-Tonk Times column. Hit that subscribe, follow, like, share button. It means a whole lot to me. Thank you to all the folks who have done it so far. Our logo was created by Boots Graham of Boots and the Hoots. And music on the show today, courtesy of Sean Burns and Lost Country, The Divorcees, and Skinny Dick. From local legends to regional stars to the cream of the Canadian crop, you're going to find it all here on the Northern Report. Thanks for tuning in, folks. We'll chat later. Hey, what you got for us?
I'm drifting into gently heaving deep water.